On the night of the 25th of August, 1942, approximately 1,200 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops waited ashore at Milne Bay on the southeastern tip of Papua New Guinea, confident they would overwhelm the small Australian garrison defending 3 newly constructed airstrips that threatened Japanese supply lines to their forces advancing down the Kokoda Track toward Port Moresby. Japanese intelligence estimated 2 to 3 Australian companies held the position, perhaps 200 to 600 men at most. They landed with 11 to 14 light tanks, overwhelming firepower for what they believed would be a brief, brutal operation lasting no more than 48 hours. What they encountered instead were more than 8,500 Australian and Allied troops dug into prepared defensive positions, supported by 2 squadrons of Royal Australian Air Force fighters that would turn the jungle coastal track into a slaughterhouse and prove for the first time in the Pacific War that Japanese amphibious invasions could be decisively defeated on the ground. By August of 1942, the Allied strategic position in the Pacific had deteriorated to a point where military planners in Washington and London openly discussed whether Australia itself could be defended against Japanese invasion. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor had witnessed Japanese conquest on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. Conquests that seemed to validate everything pre-war observers had claimed about Japanese military prowess and Western colonial weakness. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress protecting British interests in Southeast Asia, had fallen on the 15th of February, surrendering 70,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to a Japanese force half that size, in what Winston Churchill described as the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines, defended by combined American and Filipino forces commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, had held out until the 6th of May when the final American positions on Corregidor surrendered, sending MacArthur fleeing to Australia, where he established headquarters in Melbourne and began planning operations to recapture territory that Japanese forces now controlled across an area stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The Dutch East Indies, with their critical oil resources, had fallen in March after brief resistance that demonstrated how thoroughly Japanese combined arms doctrine had evolved beyond Western military thinking that still treated naval, air, and ground forces as separate entities requiring separate commands and separate strategic objectives. The strategic tide had begun turning in May and June of 1942, with battles that checked Japanese expansion without reversing it, creating a precarious equilibrium where neither side possessed sufficient strength to achieve decisive victory, but where the trajectory of conquest had shifted from Japanese advance to mutual exhaustion. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought from the 4th through the 8th of May in waters between Australia and the Solomon Islands, represented the first naval engagement in history where opposing fleets never came within visual range of each other, fighting instead through carrier aircraft that attacked enemy ships while their parent vessels maneuvered beyond the horizon. Japanese forces intended to land at Port Moresby, the Allied base on Papua New Guinea's southern coast, whose capture would provide air bases within striking distance of northern Australia and complete Japanese encirclement of the Australian continent. Allied naval forces intercepted the Japanese invasion convoy, sinking the light carrier Shoho and damaging the fleet carrier Shokaku, while losing the fleet carrier Lexington and suffering damage to Yorktown that should have put her out of action for months. The tactical result was ambiguous, with both sides claiming victory and both sides suffering losses that affected their future operations. But the strategic outcome was unequivocal, because the Japanese troop convoy turned back without attempting the Port Moresby landing, marking the first time Japanese offensive operations had been stopped short of their objectives. The Battle of Midway, fought from the 4th through the 7th of June in waters northwest of the Hawaiian Islands, transformed the Pacific War's strategic balance through catastrophic Japanese losses that eliminated their carrier superiority and shifted initiative permanently toward the United States. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku planned to destroy the remaining American carrier force by attacking Midway Island and forcing American carriers to respond, allowing Japanese naval aviation to finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. American cryptographers broke Japanese naval codes and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with Japanese plans in sufficient detail that American carriers positioned themselves for ambush rather than responding to bait. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught 3 Japanese fleet carriers with their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch, destroying Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in the span of 5 minutes that represented the most decisive 5 minutes in naval warfare history. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched counterattacks that sank Yorktown before being destroyed herself, leaving Japanese naval aviation permanently crippled through losses of 4 fleet carriers and their highly trained aircrew that represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation and could not be replaced given Japanese industrial capacity and training infrastructure. The battle established American naval superiority in the Central Pacific that would only grow more pronounced as American industrial production delivered new carriers at rates Japanese shipyards could never match. But in the southwestern Pacific, where MacArthur commanded Allied forces, and where the struggle for New Guinea would determine Australia's security, the strategic situation remained precarious through August, as Japanese ground forces advanced down the Kokoda Track toward Port Moresby and planned the amphibious operation against Milne Bay that would test whether Japanese amphibious invasions could be stopped by prepared defenders. On the 7th of August, United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning a campaign that would consume both sides' resources for 6 months and create the strategic context within which the Battle of Milne Bay occurred as simultaneous operations competing for resources and attention. The Marines seized Henderson Field, a partially constructed Japanese airbase whose completion would have threatened Allied supply lines between the United States and Australia. But Japanese forces responded with determination to recapture the island that became symbolic of control over the Solomon Islands chain. Naval battles in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal produced losses on both sides that demonstrated how evenly matched the antagonists remained despite Midway, how neither side possessed sufficient strength to achieve quick, decisive victory in the grinding attritional warfare that the Pacific theater was becoming. For MacArthur in Australia, Guadalcanal represented competition for scarce resources. American attention in shipping diverted toward the Navy's Central Pacific advance, rather than concentrated in the southwestern Pacific, where MacArthur believed the war would be won or lost. His forces in New Guinea faced Japanese offensives on 2 axes simultaneously. The overland advance down the Kokoda Track that threatened Port Moresby from the north, and the planned amphibious assault on Milne Bay that would threaten Port Moresby from the east if successful, creating potential encirclement that would isolate Australia's only secure base on New Guinea and open northern Australia to Japanese air attack. Milne Bay sat at the southeastern extremity of Papua New Guinea, a natural harbor approximately 20 miles long and 4 to 6 miles wide, surrounded by jungle-covered mountains rising to 3,000 feet that channeled movement onto a narrow coastal strip varying from a few hundred yards to a mile in width, depending on how aggressively the jungle and swamps encroached on the only terrain where vehicles could operate. The bay itself provided excellent anchorage for supply ships and potential seaplane operations, making it attractive to both sides as a forward base that could support operations along New Guinea's southern coast. 3 rivers emptied into the bay, creating swamps and waterlogged terrain where digging proper trenches was impossible because water tables sat close to the surface throughout the region, forcing engineers to build breastworks above ground level using sandbags and excavated earth, rather than excavating below ground, where standing water would flood any position deeper than a few feet. Dense jungle covered everything except the narrow coastal strip. Primary rainforests so thick that visibility extended only a few yards in most places, and movement off established tracks required machetes and exhausting physical effort to cover even short distances. The single coastal track connecting positions along the bay represented the only route where vehicles could operate. A primitive road that the constant rain transformed into a muddy nightmare, where even tracked vehicles struggled and wheeled transport often became completely immobilized. Australian and American military planners identified Milne Bay's potential in early 1942, when MacArthur's headquarters began searching for locations where forward air bases could support operations against Japanese positions on New Guinea's northern coast and protect Port Moresby from potential attacks on its eastern flank. Engineers arrived in June. The 43rd Engineer Regiment General Services from the United States Army, bringing approximately 1,300 men whose primary mission was constructing the base infrastructure rather than fighting, supplemented by Australian engineer units and labor detachments that brought the total engineer strength to nearly 2,000 men working in conditions that made construction a battle against nature as much as a race against Japanese offensive operations. They built 3 airstrips designated Number 1, Number 2, and Number 3, crude facilities by metropolitan standards, but operational runways where fighters could land and take off, despite the rain that fell almost continuously, and turned the laterite surfaces into mud that required constant maintenance to remain usable. Supply dumps, fuel storage, ammunition bunkers, command posts, medical facilities, maintenance workshops, all the infrastructure required to support combat operations had to be constructed from materials shipped from Australia through waters where Japanese submarines and aircraft threatened every convoy, then unloaded at primitive wharves that could handle only small vessels and transported along tracks that became impassable when heavy rains transformed them into rivers of mud. The 7th Australian Infantry Brigade deployed to Milne Bay in July under command of Brigadier John Field, approximately 4,500 infantry, arriving to defend the base that engineers were still constructing and to garrison positions that existed more on planning maps than in physical reality. The brigade consisted of 3 battalions, the 2nd 9th and 2nd 10th battalions, that were veteran Australian Imperial Force units with combat experience in the Middle East, where they had fought against German and Italian forces in the Western Desert campaigns, and the 61st Battalion that was a militia unit recruited from Queensland and filled with men who had trained in Australia but never experienced combat. The militia forces, officially the Citizen Military Forces, occupied an ambiguous position in Australian military culture, where regular AIF soldiers sometimes questioned their training and determination. Despite the fact that many militia soldiers were physically and mentally indistinguishable from their AIF counterparts, and the legal distinction that prevented militia forces from serving outside Australian territory was political rather than reflecting any genuine difference in capability. Anti-aircraft batteries deployed to defend the airstrips against Japanese air attack, searchlight units to illuminate night raiders, coastal defense guns to protect against naval bombardment, medical units to treat the casualties that everyone understood would occur once Japanese forces detected the base and attacked it. All the supporting elements that transformed Milne Bay from a name on a map into an operational military installation that represented Australian determination to hold forward positions despite Japanese pressure. Number 75 and Number 76, squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force deployed to Milne Bay in late July and early August, flying P-40 Kittyhawk fighters that represented American military aviation technology adapted to Pacific conditions, where long range and ruggedness mattered more than the high-altitude performance that European air combat emphasized. Each squadron operated 12 to 16 aircraft, depending on mechanical serviceability and availability of spare parts, modest numbers that reflected Australian industrial capacity and American production priorities that favored supplying British and Soviet forces fighting Germany over fully equipping Pacific theater operations. The Kittyhawks were robust aircraft powered by Allison engines that proved more reliable than the temperamental Merlin engines that powered Spitfires, armed with .650 caliber machine guns that could shred ground targets when pilots pressed attacks to close range, capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy more fragile aircraft and still returning their pilots to base. The air crews understood their mission extended beyond air-to-air combat to include ground attack operations where their machine guns and bomb loads would provide the only close air support available to infantry defending the base against Japanese assault, making them critical to defensive plans that assumed air superiority would compensate for numerical disadvantages if Japanese forces attacked with strength that overwhelmed ground defenses. Major General Cyril Clowes, born on the 13th of March, 1892, in Carlton, Victoria, assumed command of what was designated Milne Force in July of 1942, bringing to this critical position a background that combined pre-war militia service with recent combat experience, but also reflected the ambiguous status that militia officers occupied in Australian military hierarchy, where regular Army professionals sometimes questioned whether citizen soldiers possessed the professional competence to command operations where lives depended on tactical decisions made under stress. Clowes had served as a militia artillery officer before the war, combining civilian professional life with part-time military service, in the tradition that British Commonwealth nations maintained as alternative to large, standing armies, rising through ranks based on competence demonstrated during peacetime training exercises that tested organizational ability and theoretical knowledge, but could not replicate the chaos of actual combat. His appointment to command the 6th Australian Division's artillery in North Africa brought him into combat for the first time at an age where most officers were either retired or occupying senior staff positions away from frontline fighting, demonstrating capability that earned mention in dispatches for his performance during the Western Desert campaigns, where Australian artillery supported infantry operations against German and Italian forces. His promotion to command Milne Force reflected confidence that his methodical approach and organizational competence suited the defensive mission, though events would prove that his cautious tactical judgment clashed with aggressive instincts that MacArthur's headquarters preferred and that characterized American military culture, where offensive action was valued over patient defensive fighting, even when circumstances favored defense. Clowes was a professional in the best sense of that term, a man who studied military history and doctrine, who understood logistics and administration, who recognized that successful military operations depended on careful planning and thorough preparation rather than martial enthusiasm or aggressive spirit divorced from practical reality. His personality reflected his background, methodical and by the book, conservative in tactical approach, because he understood that commanders who took unnecessary risks with soldiers' lives were morally culpable for casualties that resulted from poor judgment, regardless of whether those casualties occurred during victorious operations or disastrous failures. He would face criticism from MacArthur's staff for being too defensive, too slow to counterattack, too concerned with preserving his force rather than destroying the enemy with maximum aggression, criticism that reflected fundamental differences in military philosophy between commanders who believed defense was the only path to victory and commanders who understood that defensive operations conducted properly could achieve decisive results while minimizing friendly casualties. History would vindicate Close's approach at Milne Bay, recognizing that his patient defensive battle achieved complete victory at minimal cost. But the vindication would come decades after his death, when historians analyzing the battle with access to Japanese sources and without the emotional heat of wartime pressures could assess his decisions objectively, rather than through the lens of aggressive doctrine that dominated American military thinking. Group Captain William Henry Garing, commanding the Royal Australian Air Force squadrons at Milne Bay, brought operational flying experience and understanding of air power's potential that would prove critical to defensive success when Japanese forces landed and discovered that Australian fighters controlled the skies over the battlefield. His relationship with Close produced friction over priorities and resource allocation, tensions that reflected broader institutional divisions between Army and Air Force commanders who viewed the same tactical problems through different professional frameworks and sometimes struggled to coordinate operations that required subordinating service-specific preferences to combined arms effectiveness. Garing wanted to preserve his aircraft for air-to-air combat and strategic missions, understanding that replacing destroyed fighters was difficult given production priorities and supply line vulnerabilities, while Close demanded maximum air support for ground operations, where pilots would expose themselves to ground fire while attacking targets at low altitude. The tension between preservation and commitment that characterized their relationship would be resolved through combat, where the immediate tactical necessity of supporting infantry under attack outweighed longer-term concerns about aircraft attrition, demonstrating how actual fighting clarified priorities that peacetime planning left ambiguous. Commander Minoru Yano of the Imperial Japanese Navy, commanding the Corps 5th Special Naval Landing Force that would execute the amphibious assault on Milne Bay, embodied the aggressive confidence that characterized Japanese military culture in 1942, after 6 months of uninterrupted conquest had created institutional conviction that Japanese forces were inherently superior to Western armies, and that Japanese expertise in jungle warfare made them unbeatable in the tropical environments where the Pacific War was being fought. Special Naval Landing Forces functioned as Japanese naval infantry, elite troops trained for amphibious operations and offensive combat, equivalent to United States Marines in their institutional role and reputation, though organized and equipped differently based on Japanese naval doctrine. Yano had commanded the Corps 5th through combat operations in China and the early Pacific campaigns, developing confidence in his troops' capability and his own tactical judgment that would prove catastrophically misplaced when intelligence failures delivered him into a battle where every assumption about enemy strength and capability was wrong. His aggressive personality suited offensive operations where speed and shock could overwhelm unprepared defenders. But those same traits became liabilities when attacking prepared positions defended by forces whose strength exceeded Japanese estimates by more than 10-1. Creating tactical situations where aggression without reconnaissance produced casualties that accomplished nothing except demonstrating courage that tactical circumstances made irrelevant. Brigadier General George Frederick Wooten, born on the 20th of October, 1893, commanded the 18th Australian Infantry Brigade that would arrive as reinforcement during the battle and lead the counter-offensive that drove Japanese forces back to their landing beaches and destroyed their offensive capability. His First World War service and subsequent military career provided background that contrasted with Close's more limited combat experience. Though both men shared professional competence and methodical approach to military operations that distinguished competent commanders from those whose aggressive instincts outran their tactical judgment. Wooten's brigade consisted of veteran battalions with Middle East combat experience, units whose performance in North Africa demonstrated both capability and limitations of Australian infantry when properly led and adequately supported. His arrival at Milne Bay would provide additional combat power when Japanese offensive operations had already been stopped by the initial defensive fighting, allowing his fresh battalions to exploit Japanese exhaustion and supply difficulties rather than facing the elite troops at peak effectiveness who had landed on the 25th of August, confident they would sweep aside minimal resistance. Lieutenant Colonel John Moten commanded the 61st Battalion, the militia unit that would fight the initial defensive action when Japanese forces collided with Australian forward positions. Demonstrating that militia soldiers could perform credibly in combat when led by competent officers and given missions that matched their training level. His death on the 30th of August would remove from the battlefield one of the officers whose courage and tactical competence had helped stabilize Australian lines during the critical first days when Japanese attacks threatened to overwhelm forward positions before reinforcements could arrive and defensive lines could be strengthened. Commander Shojiro Hayashi of the Sasebo 5th Special Naval Landing Force would bring approximately 500 to 600 reinforcements to Milne Bay on the 29th of August, arriving too late to affect the battle's outcome, but in time to share the disaster that awaited Japanese forces who had committed themselves to an operation that faulty intelligence had made unwinnable from the moment planning began. On the 8th of August, 1942, Japanese Southeast Area Headquarters at Rabaul finalized plans for Operation RE, the amphibious assault on Milne Bay that was intended to establish a seaplane base supporting operations along New Guinea's southern coast and to protect the eastern flank of Japanese forces advancing down the Kokoda Track toward Port Moresby. The operation reflected strategic logic that was sound in concept but catastrophically flawed in execution because the intelligence estimates underlying every tactical assumption were wrong by such enormous margins that success became impossible regardless of Japanese courage or tactical skill. Japanese planners estimated that Milne Bay was defended by 2 to 3 Australian companies, perhaps 200 to 600 men total, a force that the Kure 5th Special Naval Landing Force could overwhelm through combination of superior numbers, tactical surprise achieved by night landing, and shock effect created by 11 to 14 Type 95 Hago light tanks, whose appearance on the battlefield would presumably terrify defenders who expected no armor support and whose anti-tank capabilities were assumed to be minimal or non-existent. The intelligence catastrophe that made Japanese defeat inevitable originated in reconnaissance failures and analytical mistakes that compounded each other until the picture presented to operational commanders bore no resemblance to reality. Japanese aerial reconnaissance of Milne Bay had been limited and intermittent. Constrained by weather that made visual observation difficult and by Australian fighter patrols that discouraged Japanese reconnaissance aircraft from lingering over the target long enough to conduct thorough analysis. Photographs that were obtained showed some construction activity and defensive positions, but failed to reveal the true scale of Australian deployment, because much of the garrison was dispersed throughout the area in positions that aerial photography could not detect beneath jungle canopy. Intelligence analysts examining the limited photographic evidence apparently concluded that what they saw represented the entirety of Australian presence, rather than recognizing that dispersed forces might be concealed in areas where photography showed nothing. A failure of analytical imagination that assumed Australian deployment patterns would match Japanese expectations, rather than adapting to local terrain and tactical requirements. The estimate of 2 to 3 companies may have originated from counting visible defensive positions or vehicles and extrapolating force strength from incomplete evidence. A methodology that produced catastrophically wrong conclusions when the actual Australian strength exceeded 8,500 troops, including 3 full infantry brigades plus supporting units. The Japanese force designated for Operation RE consisted of approximately 1,200 to 1,500 troops of the CURE 5th Special Naval Landing Force, elite infantry whose training emphasized offensive operations and night fighting, but who lacked the heavy weapons and artillery support that would be essential for attacking prepared defensive positions defended by forces whose actual strength made the Japanese numerical advantage that planners assumed into a numerical disadvantage of approximately 6 to 1. The 11 to 14 Type 95 Heigo light tanks represented revolutionary addition to Japanese capabilities in the New Guinea, theater where terrain had been assumed too difficult for armored operations, demonstrating Japanese willingness to attempt tactical innovations that might provide decisive advantages if executed successfully. The tanks were small vehicles by European standards, weighing less than 8 tons and armed with a single 37mm main gun supplemented by 2 machine guns. Protected by armor that was adequate against small arms fire, but vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, and even to determined infantry using grenades or other improvised methods. Their value lay not in their combat power, which was modest compared to medium tanks that European armies employed, but in their psychological effect on infantry, who expected no armored opposition, and in their ability to support infantry attacks by suppressing defensive positions with direct fire that machine guns and rifles could not match. The landing plan called for 7 transport ships to approach Milne Bay during darkness on the night of the 25th of August, disembark troops and equipment near Ahioma on the bay's eastern shore approximately 4 miles from KB Mission, where Australian forward positions were known to exist, then advance westward along the coastal track toward the airstrips that were the operation's ultimate objective. The night landing was intended to achieve tactical surprise and prevent Australian aircraft from attacking the vulnerable transport ships during the disembarkation phase, when troops and equipment would be concentrated on beaches where air attack could inflict devastating casualties. The plan assumed that once ashore, Japanese forces would advance rapidly against the minimal resistance that intelligence estimates suggested, overwhelming the 2 to 3 Australian companies before they could organize effective defense or before reinforcements could arrive from Port Moresby. The timeline called for capturing the airstrips within 48 hours. An aggressive schedule that reflected confidence in Japanese superiority and underestimation of Australian capability based on intelligence that bore no relationship to actual conditions that awaited the assault force. Supply planning assumed the operation would require 10 days, allowing time for capturing objectives, consolidating positions, and beginning construction of seaplane facilities that were the strategic purpose of the entire operation. Troops carried rations and ammunition calculated for this duration, supplemented by supplies that would be landed with the initial assault force and by resupply missions using barges operating from Rabaul along the New Guinea coast. The supply plan contained no provisions for failure, no contingency planning for sustained combat against determined opposition, No recognition that operations might extend beyond 10 days if Australian resistance proved more effective than intelligence estimates suggested. Coordination with Japanese forces advancing down the Kokoda Track was minimal, reflecting organizational separation between Navy-led operations like Milne Bay and Army-led operations like the Port Moresby Advance. A manifestation of institutional rivalries that prevented integrated planning and created situations where simultaneous operations competed for resources and attention rather than supporting each other through coordinated pressure that might have overwhelmed Australian defenses if concentrated rather than divided between separate axes. As the 7 transport ships carrying Commander Yano's assault force departed Rabaul on the 24th of August, steaming southward through waters where Allied coast watchers would track their progress and radio warnings to Australian headquarters, the fundamental mismatch between Japanese assumptions and Australian reality guaranteed that the operation would achieve the opposite of its intended purpose. Japanese forces were sailing toward a battle where numerical superiority they expected to enjoy would actually favor their opponents by margins that made victory impossible, where tactical surprise they counted on would be negated by advance warning that allowed defenders to man positions and prepare for attack, where armor that was supposed to terrorize defenders would instead be destroyed piecemeal by infantry, who adapted quickly to threat they had not anticipated, where air superiority that Japanese planning assumed would belong to them, or at least be contested, would instead belong absolutely to Australian fighters that would make daytime movement suicidal for Japanese forces trapped on a narrow coastal track with nowhere to hide. On the 24th of August, 1942, the Allied Coast Watcher network that operated throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea detected the Japanese convoy approaching Milne Bay and radioed warnings that allowed Australian commanders to alert their forces and prepare for the attack that intelligence had suggested might occur, but whose exact timing and location remained uncertain until Coast Watcher reports provided concrete information. The Coast Watcher network represented one of the Pacific War's most effective intelligence systems, civilian and military personnel operating behind Japanese lines with radio equipment that allowed them to report ship movements and aircraft sightings that gave Allied forces precious hours of warning before attacks developed. Royal Australian Air Force reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the Coast Watcher reports on the afternoon of the 24th, identifying 7 transport ships escorted by cruisers and destroyers, providing visual confirmation that a major operation was imminent and that Milne Bay was almost certainly the target given the convoy's course and speed. Major General Clowes issued orders alerting all units at Milne Bay, directing infantry battalions to man defensive positions, ordering anti-aircraft batteries to full readiness, instructing Royal Australian Air Force squadrons to prepare for dawn takeoff when Japanese landing would likely have been completed, and when attacking enemy forces would provide targets for fighter-bomber operations. Soldiers checked weapons and equipment in the methodical routine that combat veterans and well-trained units execute without drama, ensuring magazines were loaded and grenades were accessible, and entrenching tools were available for improving positions once firing began. Officers walked positions, verifying that fields of fire were clear and that defensive arrangements provided mutual support between positions so that attackers could not isolate and overwhelm individual positions before neighboring units could respond. The tension that accompanies waiting for battle settled over the base as darkness fell on the 24th. Soldiers knowing attack was imminent, but not knowing exactly when or where Japanese forces would land or in what strength they would come. The uncertainty that precedes combat, where imagination sometimes creates worse possibilities than reality will deliver. During the night of the 24th to the 25th of August, Japanese cruisers bombarded Milne Bay installations in preparation for the landing that would follow. Shelling that was intended to suppress defensive positions and destroy facilities, but that accomplished little because Australian positions were dispersed and protected, and because naval gunfire, without accurate target information, typically produces more psychological effect than physical damage. The bombardment confirmed to Australian commanders that landing was imminent, removing any remaining uncertainty about Japanese intentions and allowing final preparations during the remaining hours before assault forces would come ashore. Rain began falling during the night, the first of the rain that would continue almost without interruption throughout the battle, and that would transform terrain and tactical calculations in ways that benefited defenders and hindered attackers by making movement difficult and air operations intermittent, while creating miserable conditions that tested endurance on both sides. At 2300 hours on the 25th of August, as Australian soldiers in forward positions strained to hear movement through the drumming rain and dense jungle darkness, 7 Japanese transport ships approached the coast near Ahioma and began lowering landing craft that carried more than 1,000 Special Naval Landing Force troops toward beaches, where they expected to encounter minimal resistance. Some navigation errors scattered landing forces more widely than planned, with units coming ashore at slightly different locations that complicated command and control, but did not prevent the essential task of getting troops onto the beach and organized for the advance toward objectives. The tanks landed successfully despite concerns about whether landing craft could handle their weight and whether beaches could support tracked vehicles without bogging them in sand, demonstrating Japanese technical competence in amphibious operations, even as strategic and tactical planning failures doomed the operation. Approximately 1,200 troops established themselves ashore by midnight, forming into column for the advance along the coastal track toward KB Mission and the airstrips beyond, tanks leading because their presence on the battlefield would shock defenders, and their firepower would suppress any resistance encountered during the approach march. The Japanese column began advancing westward shortly after midnight, moving through darkness and rain along a coastal track that navigation made difficult and that the terrain confined to a narrow corridor where maneuver was impossible and where forces were channeled into formation that would prove ideal for ambush or for artillery fire if Australian forces detected the advance. At approximately 0200 hours on the 26th of August, the Japanese column collided with the 61st Battalion's forward positions at KB Mission, initiating combat that began in confusion and darkness, and that demonstrated immediately that Japanese intelligence estimates were catastrophically wrong because resistance encountered exceeded anything that planners had suggested was possible. Australian soldiers in forward positions opened fire on the approaching column, muzzle flashes lighting the jungle as rifles and machine guns engaged targets that appeared as movement in the darkness rather than as clearly defined enemy soldiers. Japanese infantry deployed from column into attack formation, engaging Australian positions with rifle fire and machine gun fire, while tanks maneuvered forward to suppress defensive positions with their main guns and machine guns. The appearance of tanks shocked Australian defenders who had received no intelligence suggesting Japanese forces possessed armor, and who suddenly faced direct fire from vehicles that their weapons could not effectively engage at range. The 61st Battalion, fighting its first major action, responded with the mixture of panic and determination that characterizes inexperienced units encountering unexpected threats, some soldiers breaking under the shock of tank assault, while others maintained positions and continued fighting with courage, that demonstrated that militia training could produce soldiers capable of performing under combat stress when properly led. The battalion fought a delaying action through the pre-dawn hours, trading space for time in the tactical pattern that competent defenders execute when facing superior firepower, falling back from forward positions toward prepared fallback positions while maintaining cohesion and continuing to inflict casualties on attacking forces. By dawn on the 26th of August, KB Mission had fallen to Japanese forces who had pushed Australian defenders back approximately half a mile, paying for this advance with casualties that were heavier than expected, and that suggested resistance would be more determined than intelligence estimates had predicted. As first light broke over Milne Bay on the morning of the 26th of August, Royal Australian Air Force pilots of No. 75 and No. 76 squadrons climbed into their P-40 Kittyhawks and took off into weather that was marginal for flight operations, but adequate for the close air support mission that tactical circumstances demanded. They found the Japanese column strung out along the coastal track, where concealment was minimal and where troops and vehicles made perfect targets for aircraft attacking at low altitude with machine guns and small bombs. The first strafing runs caught Japanese infantry in the open, 50 caliber rounds tearing through human bodies and equipment with devastating effect. Soldiers falling in rows as pilots pressed attacks to close range where accuracy was certain, and where defensive fire from small arms was ineffective against aircraft moving at speeds that made aiming nearly impossible. The tanks, which had been invulnerable to small arms fire during the night fighting, now became priority targets for pilots who recognized that destroying armor would eliminate the psychological advantage that tanks provided and would prevent Japanese forces from using mechanized firepower to suppress Australian defensive positions. The air attacks transformed the tactical situation instantly, negating Japanese advantages in mobility and firepower by making daytime movement suicidal and forcing Japanese forces to seek cover in jungle and coconut plantations, where Australian defensive positions could engage them at close range. Commander Yano's plan had assumed that once ashore and advancing, Japanese forces would maintain momentum through aggressive attacks that overwhelmed defensive positions before defenders could organize effective resistance. But Royal Australian Air Force interdiction made sustained advance impossible during daylight hours and forced Japanese operations into night attacks where confusion and limited visibility negated many advantages that attackers normally enjoyed. The Japanese advance stalled as units that had pushed through KB Mission encountered the 2nd 10th Battalion, veteran Australian Imperial Force Infantry, whose Middle East combat experience and disciplined defensive fighting created a barrier that frontal attacks could not penetrate without suffering casualties that accomplished nothing except proving courage that tactical circumstances made suicidal. Throughout the daylight hours of the 26th of August, vicious fighting continued in coconut plantations and along the coastal track, where visibility was limited by vegetation and where combat occurred at ranges measured in yards rather than in hundreds of yards that characterized open-terrain fighting. Japanese infantry demonstrated the skill in close combat that their training emphasized, using covered approaches and fire and movement tactics to close with Australian positions, but defenders enjoyed advantages of prepared positions and interlocking fields of fire that channeled attackers into killing zones where machine guns and rifles inflicted casualties that mounted steadily through the day. The tanks that had been so shocking during the night fighting proved vulnerable to determined infantry. Using grenades and improvised anti-tank methods, Australian soldiers, discovering that the light armor protecting the Hago tanks could be penetrated by grenades placed against hull or turret sides, and that immobilizing tracks with concentrated fire left tanks as stationary targets that could be destroyed at leisure. The 2nd 9th Battalion moved forward to reinforce the defensive line, bringing additional veteran infantry whose performance in North Africa demonstrated competence that exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had suggested Australian forces possessed. As darkness fell on the 26th of August, Japanese forces held KB Mission and positions approximately half a mile beyond the starting point of their advance. Gains that were minimal compared to the 48-hour timeline for capturing the airstrips, and that had cost casualties approaching 100 killed and wounded from combat and air attack. Commander Yano faced tactical reality that contradicted every assumption underlying Operation RE. Recognizing that Australian strength far exceeded intelligence estimates and that Australian air superiority made daytime operations impossible, yet committed to the operation by orders from higher command and by Japanese military culture that viewed withdrawal as shameful unless authorized by superiors who understood tactical circumstances. The decision to continue attacking reflected institutional momentum and aggressive doctrine more than rational calculation of prospects for success, demonstrating how military organizations sometimes persist in failed operations because admitting failure seems worse than accepting additional casualties in pursuit of objectives that tactical reality has made unachievable. Throughout the 27th and 28th of August, Japanese forces renewed attacks that followed pattern established during the first day of fighting, night advances along the coastal track, followed by desperate attempts to overcome Australian defensive positions before dawn, withdrawing into cover when Royal Australian Air Force fighters appeared at first light to strafe any movement detected in open areas. The fighting acquired rhythm where both sides understood the pattern, but neither could break it decisively, Japanese attacks gaining minimal ground at high cost, while Australian defenders held positions that protected the critical airstrips where fighters operated and where supplies accumulated for operations throughout the New Guinea theater. Rain fell continuously, transforming the battlefield into a swamp where every movement required exhausting physical effort and where weapons fouled from moisture that penetrated every seal and every mechanism, despite soldiers' efforts to keep equipment functional. Men fought in conditions that made every hour a test of endurance, soaked to the skin within minutes of any movement, clothing rotting from constant moisture, boots disintegrating from combination of water and tropical heat that accelerated decay of leather and fabric. As night fell on the 27th of August, the character of Japanese attacks changed in ways that Australian soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. Assaults that began not with the cautious probing that characterized daylight operations, but with waves of screaming infantry that came crashing out of the jungle darkness in coordinated rushes designed as much to terrorize defenders as to overwhelm positions through physical assault. The screaming began as a distant sound that carried through the rain and jungle. Hundreds of voices raised in battle cries that grew louder as attacking forces closed the distance to Australian positions. A wall of sound that announced the attack seconds before muzzle flashes revealed the physical presence of Japanese infantry emerging from tree lines and vegetation. Bugles sounded coordination signals that cut through the cacophony of voices and weapons fire. Brass instruments producing notes that seemed incongruous in the jungle darkness, but that served Japanese tactical doctrine by signaling unit movements and maintaining coordination when visual contact between officers and men was impossible in the blackness beneath the jungle canopy. Australian soldiers crouched in defensive positions described the experience as unlike anything they had encountered in previous combat. where attacks in North Africa had been announced by engine noise or by the whistle of incoming artillery, but where the human voice had not been weaponized in the way that Japanese doctrine employed it at Milne Bay. The psychological assault of the screaming attacks was calculated to create panic among defenders who were already stressed by continuous operations and by the sensory deprivation that night fighting in tropical rain produced. Where soldiers could see almost nothing beyond a few yards and where every sound suggested potential threat. Defenders fired at sounds when visual targets disappeared in darkness, tracers arcing into vegetation where movement was detected or suspected, the defensive fire creating its own chaos as muzzle flashes destroyed night vision and made it even more difficult to distinguish actual targets from shadows and imagination. The screaming continued throughout the assaults, Japanese infantry maintaining their vocal barrage even as they closed with Australian positions and engaged in close quarters, fighting where grenades and bayonets replaced rifles as primary weapons. Some Australian soldiers later admitted that the first moments of these attacks produced genuine fear that went beyond the normal anxiety of combat, a primitive response to the auditory assault that bypassed rational military training and tapped into deeper fears of being overwhelmed by unseen enemies whose numbers and proximity could only be estimated by the volume of their voices. The effectiveness of the screaming attacks as tactical method proved limited because Australian defensive positions were well sighted and because veteran soldiers recognized that noise was not equivalent to combat power, that voices could not suppress machine gun positions or overcome interlocking fields of fire that had been carefully planned to cover all approaches to defensive lines. The Vickers medium machine guns that formed the backbone of Australian defensive firepower maintained steady fire into the darkness where screaming revealed attacking forces' positions. The guns' crews traversing and elevating by sound when visual acquisition was impossible, creating beaten zones where nothing could survive regardless of how loudly attackers announced their presence. After the initial shock of the first screaming attacks wore off, Australian soldiers adapted to the tactic and even began using it as targeting information, recognizing that Japanese forces were announcing their positions and approach routes in ways that made defensive fire more effective rather than less effective. The screaming became a signal to increase fire into specific sectors, to throw grenades towards sounds that indicated Japanese forces were massing for final assault, to call for mortar fire on coordinates where the auditory signature suggested concentration of attacking troops. The Japanese tanks that had been landing's most dramatic element were destroyed systematically through the 27th and 28th. Australian infantry learning that close assault with grenades could disable tracks or penetrate armor if soldiers accepted risks involved in approaching vehicles that were firing machine guns and main guns at point-blank range. Some tanks were knocked out by direct hits from anti-tank weapons that Australian forces possessed in limited numbers but employed effectively when opportunities presented themselves. Others were immobilized by damage to tracks or running gear, then destroyed by infantry who swarmed disabled vehicles and placed explosive charges that ignited fuel or ammunition and left hulks burning along the coastal track as monuments to Japanese overconfidence in technological solutions to tactical problems. By the evening of the 28th of August, all 11 to 14 tanks that had landed were destroyed or abandoned, their burning wrecks scattered along the narrow coastal track like steel tombstones marking the death of Japanese assumptions about armor's invincibility in jungle warfare. Eliminating the armored component that planners had expected would provide decisive advantage, and leaving Japanese forces dependent on infantry weapons alone to overcome defensive positions that were proving impervious to frontal assault. The tactical pattern that emerged during these days demonstrated fundamental principles of defensive warfare, where prepared positions defended by troops with adequate firepower can defeat numerically superior attackers when defenders enjoy support advantages that compensate for numerical inferiority. Australian defensive positions were cited to provide interlocking fields of fire that prevented Japanese forces from infiltrating between positions, with Vickers medium machine guns positioned to cover approaches and to deliver sustained fire that created beaten zones where nothing could survive. Artillery support was limited by ammunition constraints and by terrain that made positioning guns difficult, but mortars provided indirect fire that could reach dead ground, where direct fire weapons could not engage targets, forcing Japanese forces to remain dispersed and preventing concentration that might have overwhelmed isolated positions through sheer mass. Royal Australian Air Force strikes during daylight hours functioned as aerial artillery, providing close air support that prevented Japanese reinforcement or supply during daylight, and that inflicted casualties on forces attempting to move supplies forward from landing beaches to forward positions where ammunition and food were being consumed faster than night movement could replenish them. Japanese supply situation deteriorated through these days as combination of distance from landing beaches, Australian air attacks on supply routes, and weather that made movement difficult created shortages that affected combat effectiveness more decisively than battle casualties reduced fighting strength. Ammunition expenditure during night attacks and defensive fighting consumed stockpiles faster than resupply efforts could replace them, creating situations where units rationed ammunition and restricted firing to confirmed targets rather than providing suppressive fire that modern infantry tactics emphasized. Food shortages developed as rice supplies that troops carried ran out, and as resupply barges from Rabaul proved unable to deliver sufficient quantities to sustain forces in contact. Malnutrition beginning to affect soldiers, whose physical condition was already compromised by tropical diseases and by exhaustion from continuous operations without adequate rest. Medical supplies for treating wounded proved inadequate when casualties exceeded planning assumptions, and when evacuation to Rabaul was impossible during daylight hours when Australian aircraft controlled the skies, forcing Japanese medical personnel to treat wounded in forward positions without proper facilities or supplies, and contributing to death rates among wounded that would have been lower with adequate medical support. On the 29th of August, approximately 500 to 600 troops of the Sasebo 5th Special Naval Landing Force arrived at Milne Bay as reinforcement. Commander Shojiro Hayashi, bringing fresh troops who had not experienced the savage fighting that had devastated Commander Yano's original assault force, but who arrived too late to restore Japanese offensive capability because the tactical situation had already deteriorated beyond point where additional infantry could overcome Australian advantages in numbers, defensive positions, and air support. The reinforcements renewed Japanese attacks with determination that reflected their fresh condition and their ignorance of tactical realities that veterans understood, launching assaults that demonstrated courage without achieving tactical gains that justified casualties suffered. Japanese offensive doctrine emphasized aggressive attack and close combat where Japanese training and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. But at Milne Bay, these doctrinal principles encountered terrain and defensive arrangements that negated advantages that Japanese infantry normally enjoyed, and that transformed aggression into suicidal frontal attacks against positions that could not be overcome through courage alone. The final major Japanese attacks occurred on the 30th and 31st of August, Increasingly desperate assaults that reflected recognition that the operation was failing and that time remaining for achieving objectives was running out as supply situation became critical and as casualties accumulated to levels that threatened unit cohesion. On the 30th of August, Lieutenant Colonel John Moten was killed while directing defensive operations of the 61st Battalion, his death removing from the battlefield one of the Australian commanders whose leadership had been critical during the first days of fighting, when Japanese attacks threatened to overwhelm forward positions. His loss symbolized the cost that defenders paid for holding positions that protected the airstrips, demonstrating that defensive success required casualties even when tactical situation favored defense, and even when final outcome was victory, that vindicated decisions to hold ground rather than withdrawing to more secure positions further from the coast. Other Australian officers were killed or wounded during these final days of Japanese offensive operations, casualties that reduced leadership effectiveness and that forced junior officers and non-commissioned officers to assume responsibilities for which they were trained, but which they had not expected to exercise under combat conditions that tested competence and courage simultaneously. By the evening of the 31st of August, Japanese offensive capability was exhausted through combination of casualties, ammunition shortages, food deprivation, disease, and simple physical exhaustion from 2 weeks of continuous operations under conditions that would have challenged forces in peak condition, adequately supplied. Commander Yano recognized that continuing offensive operations would achieve nothing except additional casualties that would reduce the force available for defending positions against Australian counterattacks that were obviously being prepared as Australian reinforcements arrived and as defensive fighting transitioned toward offensive operations. The decision to shift from offense to defense reflected tactical necessity more than strategic choice, acknowledging through actions, if not through explicit orders, that Operation RE had failed completely, and that the question was no longer whether Japanese forces could capture the airstrips, but whether they could hold any positions at all, or whether complete evacuation would be required to prevent the force from being destroyed or captured. On the 1st of September, 1942, Major General Clowes ordered the general counterattack that his methodical defensive strategy had been building toward. Through the week of fighting that had systematically destroyed Japanese offensive capability while preserving Australian strength for the offensive operations that would exploit enemy weakness. The decision to delay counterattack until Japanese forces were clearly exhausted rather than launching immediate offensive operations when Japanese forces first stalled had been controversial, with MacArthur's headquarters at Port Moresby sending messages demanding aggressive action and questioning Clowes' tactical judgment when reports indicated that Japanese attacks were being repulsed. Clowes had resisted pressure to commit reserves prematurely, understanding that Japanese forces still possessed capability to inflict heavy casualties on attacking forces, and that patient defensive fighting, supported by air superiority, would achieve decisive results at lower cost than premature offensive operations that risked heavy casualties for uncertain gains. Events vindicated his judgment, demonstrating that methodical approach, which critics characterized as overcautious, was actually professional competence, recognizing that time favored defenders when attackers were exhausting themselves against prepared positions. Brigadier George Wooten's 18th Brigade spearheaded the counteroffensive, bringing veteran battalions whose Middle East combat experience and fresh condition contrasted with the exhausted state of Japanese forces who had been fighting continuously for a week without adequate supplies or rest. The Australian advance progressed methodically along the coastal track, clearing Japanese positions systematically rather than attempting rapid exploitation that might have created opportunities for Japanese counterattacks against exposed flanks or supply lines. The crushing nature of Australian tactical superiority became evident as the advance progressed. Australian forces moving forward against opposition that crumbled when pressed, because Japanese units lacked ammunition to sustain defensive fighting and lacked food to maintain physical strength necessary for the hand-to-hand combat that desperate last stands required. Japanese resistance, where organized units still functioned, was fierce. Rear-guard actions fought by troops who understood that death was likely, but who maintained discipline and continued fighting, because Japanese military culture emphasized duty, and because withdrawal under fire required maintaining cohesion that panicked retreat would destroy. Some Japanese positions fought literally to the last man. Defenders killed in their positions rather than withdrawing when tactical situation made continued resistance suicidal, demonstrating courage that Australian soldiers recognized even as they killed men whose bravery could not compensate for tactical impossibilities. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd of September, Australian forces pushed Japanese defenders back toward the beaches where landing had occurred 9 days earlier, recapturing KB Mission and the ground that Japanese forces had seized during their initial advance. Finding along the coastal track the evidence of battle that littered the route with destroyed equipment and bodies that had lain where they fell, because neither side could spare resources for burial during active operations. The destroyed tanks sat abandoned along the track, hulks that would remain for years as physical reminders of Japanese attempt to employ armor in terrain where tactical conditions negated technological advantages. Wounded Japanese soldiers who could not be evacuated had been left in positions where Australian patrols found them, some dead from wounds, others dying from combination of injuries and exposure and dehydration. The human cost of operations where medical evacuation was impossible and where military necessity required abandoning men who could not walk. The scale of Japanese defeat became undeniable as Australian forces advanced, the evidence accumulating with each mile recaptured that Japanese forces had been not merely defeated, but crushed. Their offensive capability destroyed so thoroughly that organized resistance had become impossible, and that survival depended entirely on successful evacuation before Australian pursuit closed the final escape routes. Royal Australian Air Force fighters continued attacking retreating Japanese forces, strafing columns, attempting to move back toward landing beaches during daylight hours, and bombing positions where troops congregated in preparation for evacuation. The air attacks prevented orderly withdrawal, forcing Japanese forces to move at night when coordination was difficult and when units became separated in darkness and unfamiliar terrain. On the 4th of September, Australian patrols reached the beaches where Japanese landing had occurred, finding positions that Japanese forces were still holding as perimeter for evacuation that was clearly being prepared as the only alternative to complete destruction or surrender that Japanese military culture made unacceptable. The final fighting occurred as Japanese rearguards held positions long enough for evacuation to begin, buying time with their lives for comrades who might escape the disaster that Operation RE had become, demonstrating that even in defeat, Japanese soldiers maintained the discipline and courage that had made them formidable opponents when intelligence and planning had given them reasonable chances of success. On the night of the 5th of September, 1942, the remaining Japanese forces began evacuating by barge. Troops wading into water to reach small craft that would ferry them to larger vessels waiting offshore, in darkness that provided concealment from Australian aircraft that had made daylight evacuation impossible, Allied aircraft attacked despite darkness and weather, pilots navigating by sound and by brief glimpses of vessels silhouetted against phosphorescent water, strafing and bombing evacuation craft with results that could not be accurately assessed, but that added to casualties that Japanese forces suffered during the withdrawal. Some barges were sunk by gunfire or bombs, troops drowning in waters that were reported to contain sharks drawn by blood and bodies from previous days' fighting. The chaos of evacuation under fire completed the crushing defeat that Milne Bay represented. Japanese forces that had landed confident of overwhelming weak opposition now fleeing in darkness and terror from defenders whose strength and capability had exceeded Japanese estimates by margins that made the intelligence failure seem almost incomprehensible. Others reached the larger vessels that would carry survivors back to Rabaul, overcrowded craft where wounded received minimal medical care, and where surviving soldiers began processing the reality that they had been decisively defeated in an operation that should never have been attempted with the forces available and the intelligence that was provided. The evacuation continued through the night of the 6th to the 7th of September. Final Japanese troops withdrawing under fire from Australian forces who pressed close enough to engage evacuation positions, but who did not attempt to overrun perimeters that desperate defenders would have contested with final intensity that would have cost Australian casualties without materially affecting outcome. On the 8th of September, Commander Minoru Yano was killed when Allied aircraft attacked his evacuation barge, ending the life of the officer who had led the operation with courage and determination that could not overcome the intelligence failures and planning mistakes that made defeat inevitable regardless of Japanese tactical skill or fighting spirit. His death symbolized the disaster that Operation RE had become, removing from further service the commander whose decisions during the battle had been competent within the constraints of intelligence and resources available, but whose initial decision to proceed with the operation, when reconnaissance should have revealed true Australian strength, represented failure of professional judgment that cost nearly 800 lives. By the 7th of September, Australian patrols confirmed that all Japanese forces had been evacuated or killed, that the battlefield along the coastal track was littered with evidence of combat but contained no living enemy soldiers, that Milne Bay remained securely in Australian hands with airstrips operational and base facilities intact. The completeness of Australian victory was beyond dispute. Japanese amphibious invasion not merely repulsed, but utterly crushed, all attacking forces either killed or driven into the sea in evacuation that itself cost hundreds of additional casualties. Every objective that Japanese planners had established for the operation remaining unachieved, while Australian control of the position, whose loss would have threatened Port Moresby, remained absolute and unshaken. The battlefield assessment conducted over following days documented the scale of Japanese defeat through physical evidence that could not be disputed, destroyed tanks sitting as monuments to tactical failure, abandoned equipment and supplies scattered along the coastal track, demonstrating supply difficulties that had hampered Japanese operations, burial sites where Australian forces interred enemy dead who had fallen close enough to Australian positions to be recovered. Australian casualties from the battle totaled 373, with 161 soldiers killed in action or died of wounds, and 212 wounded severely enough to require medical evacuation. Losses that were significant in absolute terms, but modest relative to force committed and objectives achieved. The disparity between Australian and Japanese losses illustrated the crushing nature of the victory, a casualty exchange ratio approaching 3 or 4 to 1 in favor of defenders who had enjoyed every advantage that preparation and position could provide. The 61st Battalion, the militia unit that had borne the brunt of initial Japanese attacks and whose performance had been questioned by some Australian Imperial Force soldiers who maintained prejudices about militia capability, had suffered disproportionate casualties, including its commander Lieutenant Colonel Moten, demonstrating that militia soldiers fought and died alongside regular soldiers when tactical circumstances demanded courage and when leadership was competent. The 2nd 10th and 2nd 9th Battalions, veteran units whose Middle East experience had prepared them for defensive operations even if specific tactics required adaptation to jungle warfare, had performed exactly as their combat records suggested they would, holding positions under attack and inflicting casualties on attackers without breaking or requiring relief by fresh units. Japanese casualty figures remained disputed for years after the battle, because Japanese records were incomplete, and because estimating losses during evacuation was difficult when witnesses were limited and when bodies were lost at sea or left on beaches where Australian forces never conducted systematic accounting. Estimates suggested between 600 and 750 Japanese soldiers were killed in action during the battle, with unknown additional casualties occurring during evacuation when aircraft and naval gunfire attacked overcrowded barges, and when some vessels sank with all hands during the return voyage to Rabaul. Very few Japanese soldiers were captured, single digits or at most 2 or 3 dozen prisoners taken from among wounded who were too badly injured to participate in evacuation, or who were found by Australian patrols in jungle where they had become separated from their units during withdrawal. The disparity between Australian and Japanese casualties reflected advantages that defensive operations enjoyed when defenders possessed prepared positions and air superiority, and when attackers were channeled into narrow fronts where firepower could be concentrated, demonstrating tactical principles that First World War had established, but that Japanese planners apparently believed would not apply when Japanese infantry, whose jungle warfare expertise supposedly gave them decisive advantages, faced Australian forces whose capability Japanese intelligence had drastically underestimated. The Battle of Milne Bay concluded on the 7th of September, 1942, the same week that fighting on Guadalcanal reached crisis point as Japanese reinforcements attempted to recapture Henderson Field, and as American Marines defended positions that were nearly as precarious as Australian positions at Milne Bay had been during the first days of Japanese attacks. The simultaneity of the two battles reflected broader strategic situation where Japanese forces were overextended along perimeter that stretched from Burma to Solomon Islands, attempting to maintain offensive operations at multiple points simultaneously without sufficient forces or logistical support to achieve decisive results anywhere. The strategic significance of Milne Bay extended beyond the immediate tactical victory to encompass broader implications that military analysts would recognize only gradually as the Pacific War progressed and as patterns established in August and September of 1942 crystallized into strategic realities that would govern remainder of the conflict. Milne Bay represented the first occasion during the Pacific War when Japanese amphibious invasion was decisively defeated on the ground by forces that were prepared and positioned to defend against attack, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle warfare, and demonstrating that Japanese infantry could be beaten by competent defenders who enjoyed advantages of position and support. Every previous Japanese amphibious operation during the 6 months following Pearl Harbor had succeeded in establishing beachheads and overwhelming defending forces, creating perception among Allied soldiers and commanders that Japanese forces possessed inherent superiority in amphibious operations and jungle fighting that made them nearly unbeatable when attacking. The psychological impact of this perception had been corrosive, undermining confidence and creating defensive mentality where Allied commanders planned for withdrawal rather than for victory, because they assumed Japanese forces would prevail through superior tactical skill and fighting spirit. Milne Bay destroyed these assumptions through demonstrated fact that Japanese forces could be stopped and thrown back when defenders were adequately prepared and supported, providing evidence that boosted Allied morale throughout Pacific theater, when evidence of what was possible, rather than speculation about theoretical capabilities, could be presented to troops who needed victory more than they needed explanations of why victory was difficult. The vindication of air power as decisive factor in ground combat represented second major lesson that Milne Bay demonstrated with clarity that previous battles had suggested, but not proven conclusively. Royal Australian Air Force pilots flying P-40 Kittyhawks had transformed tactical situation through attacks that prevented Japanese daytime movement, that interdicted supply routes, that destroyed armor that Japanese planners expected would provide decisive advantage, and that inflicted casualties exceeding anything that ground combat alone would have produced. The effectiveness of close air support in jungle warfare where visibility was limited and where targets were often concealed beneath vegetation demonstrated that air power required not merely technological capability, but also pilot skill in low-altitude operations where margins for error were minimal and where ground fire posed constant threat. The lessons learned at Milne Bay influenced Allied tactical doctrine throughout remainder of Pacific War, emphasizing importance of air superiority for ground operations and validating investment in fighters and attack aircraft that could provide close air support rather than focusing exclusively on strategic bombing or air-to-air combat. The intelligence catastrophe that doomed Japanese operations at Milne Bay became case study in consequences of inadequate reconnaissance and analytical failures that produced estimates bearing no resemblance to reality. Teaching Japanese military organizations lessons about importance of accurate intelligence that influenced their operations throughout remainder of war, though whether those lessons were adequately learned remained questionable given subsequent intelligence failures. The 15-to-1 disparity between estimated Australian strength and actual Australian strength represented intelligence failure of magnitude that made operational success impossible regardless of Japanese tactical competence or courage, demonstrating that even elite forces commanded by capable officers could not overcome fundamental mistakes in appreciating enemy capabilities. Japanese post-war analyses of Milne Bay emphasize the intelligence failure as primary cause of defeat, though these analyses sometimes downplayed tactical and strategic mistakes that compounded the intelligence failure and that reflected institutional weaknesses in Japanese military planning. The impact on Japanese strategic planning became apparent in subsequent operations, where Japanese forces adopted more cautious approach to amphibious operations and where intelligence gathering received greater emphasis before committing forces to attacks against positions whose strength was uncertain. The confidence that had characterized Japanese operations during the first 6 months of Pacific War never fully recovered after combination of Midway and Milne Bay demonstrated that Japanese forces were not invincible and that aggressive operations against prepared defenders could produce catastrophic losses without corresponding gains. The psychological impact on Japanese military thinking paralleled the psychological impact on Allied thinking, though in opposite direction, as Japanese commanders who had believed their forces could overcome any opposition through superior fighting spirit and jungle warfare expertise began recognizing that material factors and numerical advantages mattered more than cultural explanations for military effectiveness suggested. For Australia, Milne Bay represented vindication of strategy that emphasized holding forward positions despite risks involved in deploying forces to locations where they might be isolated and overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive, demonstrating that accepting risks of forward deployment created opportunities to defeat Japanese forces before they could threaten more critical positions closer to Australia. The reduction in invasion panic that followed Milne Bay reflected both the tactical victory itself and the broader recognition that Japanese offensive capability was limited by logistics and by finite resources that could not support simultaneous operations at all points along the extended perimeter they were attempting to defend. Australian civilian morale, which had been fragile during months when Japanese seemed unstoppable, improved dramatically after news of Milne Bay victory spread through newspapers and radio broadcasts that emphasized Australian role in defeating Japanese invasion attempt, creating narrative of Australian soldiers defending homeland that resonated with population that had feared invasion, was imminent and inevitable. Major General Cyril Claus returned from the most significant victory any Allied ground commander had achieved against Japanese forces in the Pacific War, to face criticism from MacArthur's headquarters that reflected fundamental disagreements about military doctrine and command philosophy more than objective assessment of tactical decisions. MacArthur's staff officers had demanded during the battle that Claus immediately counterattack to destroy Japanese forces, sending messages that questioned his tactical judgment and that implied his defensive approach demonstrated lack of offensive spirit that American military culture valued. Claus had maintained his methodical approach despite pressure from higher headquarters, refusing to commit reserves prematurely and waiting until Japanese forces were clearly exhausted before launching counteroffensive that achieved complete victory at minimal additional cost. The crushing totality of the victory vindicated his professional judgment in ways that should have silenced critics, demonstrating that patient defensive fighting followed by carefully timed counteroffensive had destroyed Japanese combat capability so thoroughly that evacuation became the only alternative to complete annihilation. The criticism that he was overcautious, that he lacked killer instinct, that he failed to aggressively exploit opportunities to destroy enemy forces reflected cultural differences between American preference for aggressive action and British Commonwealth preference for careful preparation, between military cultures that valued boldness and military cultures that valued professional competence, demonstrated through achieving objectives at acceptable cost. The historical record vindicated Claus through analysis that compared his decisions with alternative courses of action that more aggressive commanders might have pursued, demonstrating that premature counterattack would have risked heavy Australian casualties for uncertain gains, and that his patient defensive approach achieved decisive victory while preserving force strength for future operations. Military historians examining the battle decades after the event recognize that Claus had fought brilliant defensive battle that maximized advantages defenders enjoyed, and that minimized Australian casualties through tactical decisions that reflected professional judgment rather than timidity. The vindication came too late to affect Claus' career or reputation during the war, when MacArthur's criticism damaged his standing and ensured that he never received credit commensurate with achievement of winning first Allied land victory against Japanese amphibious invasion. He died on the 21st of August, 1968, relatively obscure despite having commanded operation that proved Japanese could be beaten and that provided desperately needed morale boost when Allied fortunes in Pacific were at lowest ebb. MacArthur's communiques reporting Milne Bay victory emphasized American participation and minimized Australian contributions in pattern that characterized his public communications throughout Pacific War, creating narrative where American forces played central role in victories that were actually achieved primarily by Australian units under Australian command. The 43rd Engineer Regiment that had built airstrips and facilities at Milne Bay was presented in communiques as combat force that had fought alongside Australian infantry, accurate in narrow sense that engineers did fight when attacked, but misleading in suggesting that American combat contribution was comparable to Australian contribution that involved 3 infantry brigades and 2 fighter squadrons conducting operations for 2 weeks. The distortion created resentment among Australian veterans who believed their achievement was being appropriated by commander who had contributed primarily through providing administrative support and strategic direction, rather than through direct participation in fighting. Resentment that persisted for decades and that influenced Australian popular memory of Pacific War, where MacArthur remained controversial figure whose military competence was respected, but whose credit-taking and self-promotion were viewed with skepticism. The Battle of Milne Bay occupies peculiar position in Pacific War memory, where strategic and tactical significance exceeded popular recognition, and where commemoration has been limited compared to other battles that captured public imagination more thoroughly. In Australia, Milne Bay is remembered as important defensive victory that proved Australian forces could defeat Japanese invasion attempts, part of broader narrative that includes Kokoda Track Campaign and defense of Port Moresby as collectively representing Australia's successful defense against Japanese threat to the continent. The commemoration has been more limited than Kokoda receives, partly because Kokoda Track Campaign involved longer duration and more casualties, and partly because Kokoda's narrative of soldiers fighting against overwhelming odds on jungle tracks leading toward Australian territory resonates more powerfully with national mythology than Milne Bay's narrative of prepared defensive battle that achieved victory through combination of air power and defensive positions. Milne Bay Memorial Park and various unit memorials commemorate the battle and honor soldiers who fought there, and annual ceremonies mark anniversary of the fighting. But these commemorations remain modest compared to Anzac Day observances and Kokoda Track commemorations that have become central to Australian military memory. In Japan, Milne Bay remains little known to general public despite its significance as tactical defeat that demonstrated limits of Japanese offensive capability and as example of intelligence failure that contributed to strategic overreach throughout Pacific. Japanese military historians recognize Milne Bay as significant tactical failure and as case study in consequences of inadequate reconnaissance, studying the battle in staff colleges, where intelligence failures and operational planning mistakes provide lessons for professional military education. The minimal public commemoration reflects broader Japanese relationship with Pacific War memory, where defeats are acknowledged but not celebrated, and where attention focuses on battles like Okinawa and narratives of Japanese suffering, rather than on operations like Milne Bay, where Japanese forces were clear aggressors attacking Allied positions. In the United States, Milne Bay is virtually unknown to general public, completely overshadowed by Guadalcanal campaign that began 3 weeks before Milne Bay and continued for 6 months with dramatic naval battles and sustained ground combat that captured American public attention in ways that 2-week battle fought primarily by Australian forces could never match. The legacy of Milne Bay endures in military historical memory as first Allied land victory against Japanese amphibious invasion, demonstration that Japanese forces were not invincible in jungle warfare, and vindication of defensive operations combined with air superiority as decisive combination that could defeat attacking forces regardless of their training or fighting spirit. The battle demonstrated that myth of Japanese military supremacy was precisely that, a myth that rested on victories against unprepared defenders during opening months of Pacific War, but that could not survive contact with competent defenders who enjoyed material advantages and tactical advantages that Japanese courage could not overcome. The ordinary Australian soldiers who fought at Milne Bay, militia and regular soldiers alike, proved through their defensive stand that Japanese infantry, whose jungle warfare expertise was supposedly unbeatable, could be defeated by defenders who understood terrain and who employed firepower effectively to disrupt attacks before they could close with defensive positions. The Royal Australian Air Force pilots who flew P-40 Kittyhawks in weather that made flight operations dangerous demonstrated that air power properly employed could transform ground combat through interdiction and close air support that prevented enemy freedom of movement and that inflicted casualties exceeding anything ground combat alone would have achieved. The front line at Milne Bay on the 7th of September sat exactly where it had been on the 25th of August before the Japanese landing. But the strategic and psychological landscape of the Pacific War had shifted irrevocably. For the first time in the Pacific War, a Japanese amphibious invasion had been stopped and decisively crushed by prepared defenders. Allied forces properly prepared and commanded had defeated elite Japanese troops in the jungle warfare, where they were supposed to be invincible, shattering the myth of Japanese military supremacy that had intimidated Allied forces since Pearl Harbor. 161 Australian soldiers died defending the airstrips that protected Port Moresby's eastern flank. 600 to 750 Japanese soldiers died attacking positions that intelligence failures and planning mistakes had made unwinnable from the moment Commander Yano's force departed Rabaul, believing they would overwhelm 2 or 3 companies when 8,000 troops waited in prepared defensive positions. The coastal track became a slaughterhouse where Japanese forces came screaming out of the jungle darkness in attacks designed to terrorize, where Australian defenders held their ground and crushed an invasion that cost Japan not merely tactical defeat, but the psychological blow of learning that their infantry could be beaten. The tide that had carried Japanese conquest across the Pacific for 6 months had finally been stopped by defenders who refused to accept that defeat was inevitable, who stood against Japanese military doctrine and emerged victorious from a battle that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific.